Caruso, who's a corporate immigration lawyer who practices in Toronto. She'll be joining us in just a little bit. Today, what we're going to talk about is the whole world of quarantining and self-isolation. So stay tuned. All right, so this episode, for those who are following the channel, is a little bit different. This is where I bring in one of the top immigration lawyers across the country to come on with me and join me to talk about some interesting topics related to immigration. And it's kind of fun because this is a no holds barred episode where we can talk about virtually anything. We express our opinions. They're only our opinions, notwithstanding whatever other organizations we're affiliated with. So these are ours, and it's a fun time to just shoot the breeze and just talk about issues that are important to all of you. Now, those of you who are following, we will try to carve out a little bit of time at the end to answer questions. But today is all about self-isolation and the quarantine measures that have been put in place by the government of Canada. So this is Canadian immigration and all of the associated organizations who are trying to keep Canada safe from this crazy coronavirus. But this is what we're going to be talking about today. So those of you who have questions, try to keep them confined to this area of self-isolation. We may throw in a few questions about, ability to travel and things like that, because they kind of go a little bit hand in hand. But this should be a lot of fun. So let me pull in BJ here. So BJ, welcome. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So BJ is one of the more well-known immigration lawyers in the country. She has a lot of different things to her credit. She was a past national chair of the Canadian Bar Association, the position that I'm filling right now. She basically writes the book on immigration, the Annotated Immigration Act, which is used by the government officers themselves, as well as all of us that practice in the industry, whether you're a lawyer, consultant, whoever. And so she is one of the more respected characters in our block, and it's great to have her joining me. So how are things in Toronto, BJ?
Oh, they're cold and they're quiet. We're quieter. We're in a lockdown now, officially at midnight to this past Sunday evening. I can say personally that it's been a sad week to see so many businesses shuttered, closed, and business owners really stressed and quite rightfully emotional about losing their livelihood in what is the busiest weeks of the year for them financially. So disappointing and challenging, just like travel is these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I was just looking at the news last night, and I've kind of kept my head down and just been working away, I think like we all have. And I just realized, or at least it just came to my attention, that Alberta is worse than Ontario, which I did not realize.
Yeah, and the numbers yesterday almost matched, and your population is significantly less than Ontario.
So it's not good. So we're waiting for the shoe to drop out here as well, and probably follow suit with other provinces. But I've got friends, I've got family that have just been hammered by this. Us, even within our practices, things have kind of slowed a bit, but we're problem solvers. So when problems arise, there's still a need for our services. And so I consider, at least myself, I've undertaken this little gratitude journal that I've been posting on social media, where every day I post something I'm grateful for. And yesterday was my job. And it's a wonderful, thing to be an immigration lawyer, notwithstanding the stresses and the pain and suffering we go through, especially this last year. But boy, when I look around to some of my friends and family and their businesses, and some of them are done. Like they are not going to survive. So
very early on, a good friend of mine that has a restaurant, she said to me when I was complaining about the long hours that I was putting in trying to keep up with all the legislative changes and the demands from clients, and then just keeping my own staff and running the business piece of it. She said, be thankful that you are busy. Since that comment early on back in March, I've held that sort of close to me, and we are busy. But every case I think is challenging. Nothing is routine. It's very difficult to give solid advice to travelers, to business people, and that's not something that I think our profession is used to. I think we're used to being on top of the law, the case law, the legislation, the policy, having a good feel for decision makers and what to expect. And all of that has just been turned upside down.
Yeah, I agree. That has been, we're so used to having all the answers. And then to be in a call with a client who's trying to move people into Canada, and we say, well, this is the way the law says it's supposed to play out, but understand that anything can happen. And so on that note, maybe you can just give the listeners just kind of a high level overview of what this is all about, this quarantine stuff. What does the law say in terms of people who are trying to come in? Now, I know there are multiple levels depending upon who you are, and it changes every day, but just generally speaking, can you kind of hit on the high points?
Yeah, so, I think everybody's familiar with the fact that there are travel restrictions in place, which are essentially two orders in council, one dealing with travelers coming from the US, and the other order in council dealing with everybody coming from any other part of the world other than the US. But what many people are not really appreciating is that there's a third order in council dealing with mandatory quarantine and isolation. And it was introduced I'm not sure that it came out at the same time as the first two did. And it followed shortly thereafter, like the week after, maybe March 24th, where I think some of the others came down around the 20th or so of March. But it's not really immigration legislation. It's public health legislation. So again, as an immigration lawyer, we're being challenged to understand something that is a whole new beast, so to speak, than what we're familiar with in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about the law, and how it's supposed to be applied, one other element to the mix are the airlines, right? And I think about the challenges in getting messages communicated to all of these private companies who play an absolutely critical role in people being able to travel. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I guess in terms of the three distinct orders in council, the airlines are being called on to figure out who gets to go on an airplane and get on a plane. And, I feel for them because I'm having a hard time keeping up with this, and I'm supposed to be an expert. So it's a lot that's been dumped on them. On top of it, they're hurting financially, and they will be fined if they allow someone to board who is then subsequently denied entry to Canada. So that's a challenge. But in terms of the third order in council, the one dealing with mandatory self-isolation, I mean, they're screening that they're going to be screening for COVID symptoms and passengers regardless. And that's not really part of what they're responsible for. In terms of the interpreting the self-isolation legislation. Instead, it's fallen to the CBSA, the Canadian Border Service Agency, and public health. And the problem that we have is that neither of them really want to own it, and they're both pointing fingers at each other. So I think that, those of us in the industry and the public have been very much subjected to that inconsistency as to who's responsible.
Yeah. So in the course of trying to administer this, so the individuals get on the plane, they travel. And if you're a business and you're sending someone into Canada, this concept of having to sit tight somewhere for 14 days can have some pretty significant consequences to that business. So how are they deciding who is going to be exempt from this quarantine or this self-isolation, and who is not?
Well, again, as I said, it's primarily the border officer, CBSA, that's adjudicating on it. So initially there were about 15, I think, set out specific circumstances. And, the beginning, when we were all locked down in March and April, it was clear that truck drivers and air crew and those individuals were going to be able to come and go. People that worked in the healthcare profession that maybe were on a border city like Windsor, Ontario, and could go back and forth to Detroit. And that all sort of made sense in the early days. But then as this wore on, more people needed to get across. And as we went from stage 1 to 2 to 3, and the economy back fully open this summer, it's handcuffed business travelers, and companies have suffered. I do want to recognize that I think it has discouraged many that would have traveled discretionary travel. I think a lot of people maybe haven't gone abroad to visit family because if and when they return, they'd be subject to the 14 days and they may not have that much vacation. So yes, it's a personal hardship for them. In some cases, it might even be a more than just a personal hardship if there's a loved one who is abroad and needs help, or is ill, has health issues, or is dying. But I do think it served the purpose of discouraging that discretionary travel, but it's handcuffing businesses and companies.
Yeah, you've identified that very clearly. There's two major cohorts. You've got the business traveler, and then you have those who are really, it's family based. And I guess tossed in, you do have the folks from the States who were traveling up to Alaska, just transiting through and stopping off in Lake Louise and Banff here in Alberta for a little visit. And obviously that wasn't received too well. And so then measures were put in place to try to restrict that. But there are genuine business needs. And so when a company, where do they start, BJ? So if they say, okay, we've got to get this person in for this project, we've got a contract with this Canadian company, we've been very patient, but we can't wait anymore. Where did they start?
Yeah, well, I think there's exemptions under Section 6 of the Order in Council, and E as an elephant. It's the one that deals with essential service. Now, again, early on, during what was the lockdown, everybody started defining essential service. Every city, every province, the federal government all had new definitions of essential service. But the problem here is none of those definitions really matter. It's what's in the Order in Council and what the chief medical officer has determined to be essential service. And there's a document that she sort of signs every month that we can't seem to get our hands on. Occasionally it pops into the public realm, and it's helpful to better define some of those particular circumstances of essential. But typically, if you are a technician or a specialist and you are working for a government or a company and you are coming to provide services in an infrastructure project related to utilities, transportation, to health, to manufacturing, telecommunications, there's about 6 or 7 industries, then you according to this additional document issued by the chief medical officer, are exempt from the self-isolation under 6E. But at first, it included if you were coming to repair equipment. And it was really tied to equipment, and then finally they included installation. Oh, agriculture is one of the other industries
Yes.
that we can't forget that's
Yes.
deemed
Yep.
essential. So this is being interpreted by border officers when you arrive, and to make matters even more confusing for people, the border officers refuse to give the traveler any documentation that they were exempted. And then they could be subject to like thousands of dollars worth of fines.
Fines. Yeah.
And I would be counseling clients, well, short of taking a picture of the officer that told you, pull over and jot on your phone descriptions, what color was their hair, their skin, whether they wore glasses, whether they had facial hair, record all of that, because, you're relying on that person's word that they said that you were exempted, and they would refuse to make a notation in the case management system, the computer system.
So BJ, why? Like I worked on the border as one of those characters in before the Canada Border Services days. I was an immigration officer, but as an officer, why would you not provide some acknowledgement or record that says, yeah, I've made a decision? Or is this preservation? They're trying to say, look, I don't want to be the guy who let the person in who then, spread COVID throughout a whole job site. Like, is that at play?
Well, I personally think it's because nowhere in the Order in Council does it make reference to the Canadian Border Service Agency being delegated the authority to make the decision. So it's referenced public health. So we've been told that there are public health officers at all of the major ports of entry, or if they're not physically there, that they're available to be consulted on. But there's finger pointing. And if you try to have one of those decisions overturned and you go to public health, they, I've got an email that clearly says that, no, that it's the decision has to be reviewed by CBSA.
Yeah, buck stops with CBSA. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And yet yesterday, in trying to get some comfort in advance of some very important workers coming across in December, a chief of one of the ports has told me that it's a public health determination under one of the other exemptions, exemption 7.2C, I think it is, of the Order in Council, where it says that if the chief public health officer finds that you are not going to be a risk and you will abide by the terms imposed, then you can come into Canada and be exempted from self-isolation. But how do you get the chief public health officer to issue such a declaration for you? And again, early on, there was, and there still is, an email address for Public Health Authority Canada that you can send to. But it was dysfunctional. It was taking 60 days to have a response back, which totally defeats the 14-day
when
isolation.
You're trying to get someone quickly in to be exempted from a 14-day and it's taking 60 days. Well, that doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah.
So did you try? So BJ, in the early days, so you had some experiences, what was it like making these requests? I'm assuming that you had to basically reach out to not just them, but anyone who would listen to this extent that us as business immigration lawyers have had to go to try to help our companies get their people in has been just unbelievable. Like, stuff we can't bill for, right? And so if they were coming, we built into our packages
If they already had a work permit or they had a work permit approval, then we would create a separate letter just to deal with self-isolation, citing the sections and making the links to essential services. And people coming, I had a lot of clients coming into the agriculture or utilities or infrastructure projects, and those ones seem to be fine. Manufacturing was much more challenging and still continues to be challenging unless you can link it to the production of food or again, utilities. But like automotive, for example, I think they're struggling a lot with inconsistent decision making, and I mean they employ a lot of people, and it's not at the plant, but it's the parts and all the other sort of domino effect in that industry. So manufacturing has been more challenging. The financial, trying to get someone in for financial, I've had border officers say, well, unless the ATM machines are down, it's not relevant. Well, hello. I mean, money has never been more important right now to keep businesses afloat. It's critical to get financial people across the border, but they're struggling a ton right now. So I think a lot of it had really depended on the industry that you were tying it to. If it was transportation, trucking, then again that was easier.
Yeah. So okay, let's take a step a little bit further down to the ground level. So what is it like? Now, I have never gone through it myself, and I'm assuming you probably haven't gone through the actual process of returning. Maybe you have, where you go through an assessment even for an officer. Our clients, they give us general overviews of what they experience when they're going through, but can you kind of walk our listeners through, kind of the process? If you're flying in, you made it past, the first line of defense, you've got on that plane, the airline said, okay, yeah, we'll let you board. Then you touch down. What is it like from there?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think in some instances, clients have reported, it all went smoothly, no problem. Got my work permit, or and was exempted from self-isolation. Again, the biggest challenge in the early days on self-isolation had been getting evidence that you were approved. At one point, Pearson, they were giving out orange pieces of paper.
Yeah, I know.
That was going to hold up. Of course, now, important for anybody tuning in to really be alive to the fact that there is a new app, Arrive Canada, that as of last Saturday, I think the 21st, people need to have this on their phones, and they need to fill it in before their arrival. And if you are exempted from self-isolation, the officer is supposed to give you a code. And when you input the code, a big green check mark will come up that will prove that you're exempted. But, again, the border officers earlier, if you phoned and said, hey, my client said that they were exempted, they think they are, but they're sort of unclear, do you have a record of it? And they didn't have a record of it. Apparently, I think the information that they were gathering from clients about where they would be self-isolating was being handed off to Health Canada to track and then to follow up on. And again, the stories there are crazy in terms of the calls over the summer months, people checking in to make sure that they were self-isolating and they weren't paddling around their lake in a canoe.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing too, BJ, is because it was so inconsistent. I remember we would prepare these massive packages on why our clients needed to be exempt from the travel, from the quarantine and self-isolation requirements. And the officers wouldn't even look at them. They would say, yep, work permit, you're in this industry, no problem, wave them in, to the point where our clients were saying, well, why are we paying you to put together these packages that they're not even looking at? and all along just waiting for that one experience when you have that one officer that says, this is not good enough. You have to, you have to go and self-isolate. And, and then there was nothing else other than this verbal instruction to go do it. So I
Yeah.
don't know if your experience was like that.
Well, it was, but I think you make a good point that being prepared is still very important. Um, even if you get lucky and you get an officer that sort of waves you through without looking at that, count your blessings that you had that package, because the opposite is more likely to happen, where you get an officer who's not inclined and needs to be persuaded. Sometimes counsel can get on the phone and speak to the officer if they'll take the call, or a supervisor, and get them to drill down into the exemption that you're relying on. Now, we talked a lot initially here about E6E. There's been some publicity, and the CBC had a number of news reports of I would say executives, more business travelers as opposed to technicians or specialists, coming up to Canada for various different reasons. And I think initially the angle was, well, these are privileged people, they're coming in on corporate jets. Well, you know what? It's safer for them to travel, and safer for the public too if they're coming in on those. It may not be environmentally friendly to come in on a corporate jet, but that shouldn't be held against them how they arrived. But the first two stories, the Minister of Public Safety, Minister Blair, I think he threw his officers under the airplane by saying that they made mistakes in those cases. Yeah. And so if you drill down and if they don't fit into this as a specialist or a technician under E as an essential service worker, then there is section F, 6F, that is a national interest letter where 3 ministers have been delegated the authority under that order in council to approve you being exempted. So I'm in the process of trying to get one of those national interest letters, and I can tell you it took me 3 weeks just to try to find out what the process was. And it's very involved. It includes a risk management plan that is quite detailed, that needs to be approved first by the province, and then it'll be sent back to, and it looks like Global Affairs is taking the primary lead on this, not the IRCC or and public safety ministers. And so, that's another option, but like I said, I think that's a tedious one. And I think that's probably the ones that the hockey, NHL, the Raptors probably tried unsuccessfully under that one as well, and the Blue Jays. But there are now a number of other sort of carved out as of, I think, earlier this month, when they updated it, or at the end of October, to allow for people that are coming and going on a regular basis, perhaps to drop off students, or because of child sharing arrangements, joint custody arrangements. So I actually haven't had to delve down into those sections yet. But one of the sections that was there all along involves if you're habitually resident and you need to regularly travel for work. So there's 2 sections, M as in mother and N as in Nancy, that deal with this. And some officers are giving it a very, very narrow interpretation, that it's meant for, people that live on a border city and go back and forth every day, like a healthcare worker at a hospital that we mentioned in Detroit. But when you read it, a person who enters Canada to return to their habitual place of residence in Canada after carrying out an everyday function that, due to geographic constraints, necessarily involves them entering the U.S. That's open, I think, for a broad interpretation.
Yeah.
But recently, earlier this month, a news reporter returning from covering the U.S. election and an event in Michigan. I think Trump was at it, but it could have been Biden, who knows? But anyhow, and on his return, he was told he had to self-isolate. Well, he was very upset because the election wasn't over. It was the next 2 weeks were critical. He needed to continue to cover the story, and he wanted out of self-isolation. So he hired a law firm in Toronto who brought a motion for an injunction and to quash the self-isolation. He lost. And the judge in this case, I haven't analyzed the decision significantly or in much detail, but I think the judge sort of said, it wasn't meant to be a broad general, and if it was, well, then everybody would be using it to cross border shop for barbecue sauce and something like that. He made reference to.
Yeah, that's a good point, because one thing that we clearly have seen, and we've brought this up with CBSA, is the extent to which an officer actually uses that reason for traveling abroad in the assessment when they return. And at this stage, we haven't had any official statements that is happening, because legally it's not supposed to, right? It's not supposed to necessarily form a part of this discussion, but
well, it's going to be very interesting, because I'm sure there are a lot of foreign workers in Canada that are Americans and have headed home this week or will be heading home tomorrow for the U.S. Thanksgiving. And upon their return, they will need to self-isolate. Many of them may try to rely on this section. I had one client who went back to the U.S. He's up here without his family for various different reasons. People may choose to come to Canada on an assignment and not have their spouse and children relocate. And in this instance, he's been here for the better part of a year away from his family. He's made a couple of trips home to have vacation and to see them. Most recently, and previously had been admitted back in and exempted from the self-isolation. But more recently, when he went back to vote, he was questioned as to why he went, and he said, well, I went to visit my family and I also went to vote. And they said, no, we're not going to let you be exempt this time. You have to self-isolate. So again, it's the inconsistency that is maddening in all of this.
Yeah. And we love, I love the fact that officers have discretion. I really do. Like if that was removed and they just did not have the level that they do, although it's very, that discretion, whether or not they choose to use it is another thing, or how they do. But it is, I think it's the lifeblood of the program.
100% agree with you, Mark.
Yeah.
Like I think that, it shouldn't be a cookie cutter, but you need transparency, and people need to know what the rules are. And the problem is if they tell you what all the rules are, then they feel that people will try to maneuver into a space.
Us crazy lawyers who then try to pin them down and prevent them from making decisions, because we're holding them to these directives that can be interpreted in many ways. And so, they'd like to be able to just exercise that direct discretion unfettered. And
but I think that this is really dangerous in this circumstance, because not so much maybe on the self-isolation piece, although many people, I know I have had a number of calls where people have traveled and then been told that the self-isolation was not going to be waived, and they've gotten right back on a plane and left. And I've also counseled people to come in to apply for their work permit first, know that they have it before they quit their job, sell their house. So they've
Yeah.
gone back to the US.
Yeah.
And so, normally they might have, stayed and looked for a home and those things, and they're forgoing those things. But
Yeah.
I guess my point is that people may be traveling unnecessarily
Yeah.
because they don't know what the outcome is going to be in advance. And to me, that's counterproductive to the order in council that says, we're trying to combat the spread of COVID-19.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So,
So one question I know that I get fairly frequently is when it comes to self-isolation, whether or not or to what extent we can actually do it with others. Whether it's a family, whether it's a group of, workers, or, what has been your experience with that?
um, I think that, like, I haven't heard that there's been a lot of diving down into that or digging into that by the CBSA officers. And my impression is that um, they view that it's their role to ensure that someone has a plan to self-isolate, but that it's up to public health to ensure that that plan is a good one, and so they're not necessarily, I think, testing or kicking the tires on people's plans too much.
Yeah.
But it is confusing because, again, the thought would be self-isolation should mean what it says. Self-isolation should be self, only you. But you can self-isolate in premises with people that didn't travel with you. You are supposed to, in those circumstances, follow the rules of keeping 2 meters apart, or wearing a mask, and disinfecting common areas. And of course, if you shouldn't be self-isolating in space where there is someone who's compromised, and so there's definitions of that: people over the age of 65 and other people with immune deficiencies and so forth.
Yeah. This whole area, like the science behind it, is just, it's so mysterious. And I'll use the example of my own family. So I had a son down in Suriname, down in South America, when this all hit. So a week before he came back, my daughter was attending school in the US. So we got her out, and my wife and her came back. So we dutifully quarantined as a family. And in those days, we quarantined. Like we were stocked up. We did not leave the house. And there was some indication that, well, you could potentially go to a grocery store or something like that. But we thought, this doesn't make any sense. If my daughter is actually, if she's carrying the virus and she's going to spread it to us, we're not going to make her stay in her room downstairs and have any contact with us. So we did that for about a week and a half. And then my son came back and we had to reset it all over again. So we had about three and a half weeks of this. And, and then flash forward to the beginning of the school year, 2 days in, there was a child and, a kid in my oldest son's grade 12 class that had COVID, tested positive. And so they sent all the kids home, but there was no indication that we as a family had to change our routine. Right.
Well, and
it's such a mystery to me. It just doesn't
well,
make
and
sense.
that's interesting because I've had one company reach out to me that have business travelers in the financial sector, and they need to go down to the US. They need to know who they're lending money to. Kick the tires down there on the business, and the people borrowing the money from them need to know that they're legit. And this is the way business is still done. It's still done face to face.
Yeah,
and
it's not virtual.
Just some things just cannot be replaced. And so, but for some of these individuals, they have their kids in some private schools, and the rules at the private schools are different. And if you are if there's someone in your family that's self-isolating, then the child can't be at school, is what the private school have said. Yeah. So, that parent who's, trying to make a living to support their family, is they're literally handcuffed, because by doing so, he or she is hurting their child, who then is penalized and can't go to school.
Yeah.
So again, it's the sort of one rule shouldn't fit all, and
Yeah.
the common sense in all of this is I think wearing thin on the general public,
I
in
agree.
particular.
Yeah, I think there's a level of fatigue that is very clearly setting in with all of us, and the news that we're getting closer to having vaccines, and the ability to see a light at the end of the tunnel, I think is something that we've all really been looking forward to, and I think when we have that light at the end of the tunnel, it really helps us to just kind of to just really reset and focus and say, okay, we can do this for a little while longer. But wow, these are definitely uncharted waters we've sailed.
Yeah. And I think too, like, right now we're seeing a lot of snowbirds head south for the winter. And they're making their own personal decisions and assessing the risk, and their circumstances, and where they're headed and what the circumstances are there. For them, they're retired. So coming back to a self-isolation rule for 2 weeks is a hardship, but it's not necessarily an economic or professional hardship. There will be people, I think, that do take winter breaks, and travel this winter for some vitamin D, and come back, because their employers are allowing them to work remotely, and so they can self-isolate and resume employment. And so, but if you're a business person that needs to travel in and out, and you every time you return, you can't, you have to self-isolate. That's a huge hardship. I had one client, and they're in the safety inspection industry, and and carrying out very, very important work, and yet can't go across to the US, because if they do, when they come back, they're going to have to self-isolate, which is going to penalize their Canadian clients that need them to go in and inspect their facilities. And again, our economies, the US and Canadian economies, are so intertwined that that it wasn't set up for this, to have the border closed. So I do, I'm frustrated that there's not, rapid testing. I mean, it's been approved now for several weeks or months, and yet, it hasn't been rolled out. Now, we do have the Alberta pilot project that people may be familiar with. And Mark, maybe I'll let you explain it, because it's your province.
Yeah. So this pilot, which is designed to kind of use kind of a two-part little testing system to allow people to, if you test negative, you're clear, then you have a couple days where you have to wait. And even with all of this, BJ, I look at it from the standpoint of their lack of faith in the testing process from the beginning. And so Alberta's pilot is designed specifically to allow people who test negative to be able to then get back and not have to quarantine. And it's currently being instituted. Well, it's being run at the major ports. And we don't have a lot of data about it. I haven't had any clients that have specifically gone through the process.
But
at this stage.
You have to stay in Alberta, right?
You do.
Like you have to.
Yeah, you can't pass through and say, haha, now I'm off to somewhere else. Yeah, you can't use it that way. Yeah, you have to be destined.
to get to Alaska
again. You have to be destined to Alberta.
Or get to Toronto.
Yeah.
But it's, and I know, you're part of the Canadian Bar Association executive, and I know the executive sort of ran this up the flag and sort of said, like, are there plans in the work to spread it across the other major airports that are open? And the response back was like a big negative. And it's like, why wouldn't you be at least thinking about that and what that could look like? And tell me the airlines wouldn't be prepared to include it in part
Oh
of
yeah.
their
Oh,
airfare.
anything to open things up for them. Yeah.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
hotel and tourist industry, right? To and I've been
Yeah.
saying that, like that, have people like head to the to a hotel, check in, get their COVID thing, and with their breakfast in the morning, get their result, and take another one, and after 48
Yeah.
hours, they're good to go. And if they're
Yeah.
not prepared to pay for it, but I think that's part of it. Like we are a Canadian culture that doesn't like to have two-tiered systems, right?
Yeah.
But this is a situation where businesses, I think, would be prepared to pay for it.
Yeah, absolutely they would. So this is a comment. I just pulled this one up, and our time is just about up. We didn't have a lot of time for questions, but there really weren't too many questions related to self-isolation. But Bodo here says, hello, in Germany, there's a new company named Yerach, which developed a new vaccine for COVID. And he says, what do you think about it? And so I think all of us would welcome any news from any country and any company, that is on the forefront of developing a vaccine to help lift us out of this whole pandemic that we're in. And I don't know what your thoughts on that are, BJ, but I'm pretty sure we're all,
Yeah,
anxiously awaiting.
I as much as I want a vaccine, I don't want it rushed. Because I want there to be confidence in it, so that the naysayers of vaccines, and we get people that are confident in it and will take it and protect themselves and their families and the other people that they're around. So again, I'm more interested right now in seeing more rapid testing done, and I get that it's not going to be foolproof 100%, but we're doing all sorts of other steps to manage the risk. I think rapid testing that is close to 100% is something that we need to move to keep the economy going. It is just not possible to allow businesses to crumble, and it's not just all about making money. It was people's mental health and
Yes.
their people have a purpose when they get up in the morning and they get dressed and they go to work or to school. So there's so many other reasons why keeping the economy going is important to our well-being, other than just the dollar. So if there are government people out there listening, let's get the rapid testing going. Let's get it at the border points, at the airports. Hopefully get the airline industry a fighting chance to survive, and so forth.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. So I'm going to flip over here just to the web view here, and this is BJ's website. If you have any questions that relate to isolation or quarantining or anything like that, just jump over to the Self website, and you can just click right here on the right, scroll down, and contact us. And that's probably, BJ, I think, one of the best ways to connect with you guys. And
Sure.
yeah, and all the contact information is here. So like I said initially, BJ is and her firm are one of the most respected firms in the country here. And I can say whatever I want because this is my YouTube channel. So the folks that I bring on here, they deserve to be brought on. And BJ is one of those lawyers who spends just hours and hours giving and giving to to the whole immigration industry, and not only for helping us other lawyers get up to speed with all of these changes, but just giving back generally. And so I'd encourage you to, if you have a question, if your company's just really stressed and the lawyer you've got isn't doing a good enough job, well, consider sliding over to BJ. All right. Well,
thanks,
thank you
Mark,
so much.
And appreciate it. And I hope everybody stays safe out there and we see some progress on this particular issue soon.
Yeah, well, we'll cross our fingers that 2021 will be a nice year for us.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay. Take care. We'll see you soon.
Right.